Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts. As the ice cream man does a little turn down my block here. Today I thought I would talk about something I'm going to refer to as the PSYOP Train. What that references is there seems to be this sort of holy war going on online underneath all the other holy wars that are going on. And the big distinction has to do with if you were to believe in anything online, a conspiracy of some sort especially, are you being duped by some PSYOP out there? A government conspiracy or probably government conspiracy to get you to believe something so that you become punished as a result of believing it, right? There's a lot of upset people. They get angry that you believe something like flat earth. Very upset. And if you talk about it and you don't freely criticize it, they get even more hurt. I know this is sort of a tired subject, but it's a good place to start in this theory because we're going to go through the theory of, governmental psyops. Or what I might say is, but let's think about what the purpose of a psyop would be. I think the most fundamental definition would be you are being misled. That's the number one reason why someone would do it. But misled usually is just the very first operating principle of a PSYOP, because in the end, what you're supposed to end up doing is getting led somewhere that's bad. And so then the question is, well, what actually occurs in order to mislead someone? So let's put a pin in that right there. We'll come right back to that. What would they want you to believe in order to damage you or mislead you or reduce your credibility? Right? There's a million things you could say out there. It's pretty much anything that's not the official story, right? The official story would be exactly where governments would want you to be every split second of your life. And so the theory, I believe, that is sort of being asserted online is, all right, if you step off the beaten path, the people at the Army Corps of PSYOPs and every other deep state organization that should be fucking shut down, is that we need to make it really painful if you're caught going off the beaten path, right? The funny part about it is that no matter how you slice it, you're thinking most of the time. Now, we know people that jump off in conspiracies all the time, and they don't think very much, and that's the problem with them. They believe anything and everything online. What's funny about it is that people who want to believe the official story use that sort of criticism to say, oh, you believe anything online, don't you? And then people who really do a lot of research think that people who believe in official stories believe anything that they hear from certain sources, right? Our group of folks here, the contributing communion of Deep Thoughts Radio, I believe our goal is to maintain control of our opinion. And as I always say, as most people say who are fairly humble about what's going on here, is don't believe everything I say. Go research it yourself. Understand that even if I point you at a particular direction, I'm probably not pointing you at all the directions. I'm probably missing tons of little directions that I went that I can't even remember. So this is one of the reasons why I have a little bit of resistance against the sort of thought police individuals that are all over YouTube who mean well. They do mean well. They want to police what we can think, what we consider to be things that we should be allowed to think or something. For me, it's like I look at people and I go, well, are they thinking? Well, then that's good, because that's what's missing from society in general. No one's thinking. That shit gets old and it messes up the world, right? But again, to paint a picture inside of our minds, let's restart here. We have an official story path, the sort of revised history, propaganda, understanding of our world with fake gods that don't exist, fake prophets that never existed, fake history that never existed, and that is literally sewn into the brains of people on Earth. I mean, it's phenomenal how many people actually believe that there was a Noah's Ark and that the whole place, flooded, and that there really were two of every animal on a particular boat. That blows me away that anyone would ever assert such a thing. But that's the official story. It's no mystery my disbelief in the story of Christ and his existence basically being nothing more than a fictional construct to give Rome, reign over their own people when they were about to collapse, right? They gave them an extra 1,200 years of, self-taxing mindset, right? Today it's a little more subtle. Today, as long as you have a computer-generated image of the universe doing a big bang, of far-off planets that are one way or the other, society is willing to jump on board and say, well, hey, my life's pretty boring. Why don't I go ahead and believe in all this stuff? It's more fun. And hey, you know what? Probably nothing wrong with that, if that's your choice as an adult. I think that it starts becoming a little bit of an accountability issue when you start passing that to your children, instead of saying, well, you know what, I'm a lazy fuck and I believe all this shit just because I don't want to read a book. I don't know how to read. And so, kid, don't listen to anything I believe. You go to school, you learn how to read. Don't buy, books simply because they have big pictures in them. And at least you will not hobble the next generation that may be necessary in order to save us from a true cataclysmic event, right? I think it would be interesting. Imagine that, NASA has been lying about almost everything they've ever done. They're spinning off agencies like SpaceX, And then some earth-shattering thing starts to occur, right? A big-ass meteorite is coming at Earth. Let's just say all that's real, too. And we need to get the fuck off this planet. We need to get inside some ship and get out of here. But NASA's been lying the entire time at $60 million a day. And they're, we pull out all the most covert technology in the one. I know that some of you ufologists who love Area 51 ideas and S4 think we've got all kinds of stuff. And maybe we do, but because it's been so covertly, hidden, we're not able to build a big giant ship to get enough people off the planet to actually preserve humanity. But all this coveting, the nerds with the passwords, used to be the janitors with the keys. Society turns to all these aerospace folks and all these folks that have been living on lies, and they say, get us off this planet. This thing is coming in. It's going to take, let's just say, a year to get here. You have the entire resource pool of the world for free. Infinite human beings, infinite resources. No one's looking for a paycheck. Everyone's feeding everyone for free. We just are trying to build an ark to get off this planet, right? And now all the lies start coming out. And people who are scared for their life start to tell the truth for the very first time. We don't have any of this technology. Nothing is up in space, or what's up in space is crap. The ISS is fake. The space shuttle was fake, or whatever. Right? I'm not trying to pull on other conspiracies. But I got off track. The straight and narrow path is the official story. Believe, don't question, don't research, just believe. The state will tell you who to hate, who to love, what is true, what is false, what you can do and what you can't do. All your God-given rights of the Republic are now, extorted to you. But you got to do things for someone else, right? And another equal human being to you in your brain, because you accepted a paradigm of authority, can tell you what to do. Now, sadly, of course, every time I say that, I think about the kids that can't speak their own language remotely correct, and them saying, "You can't tell me what to do." So anything outside this line would be considered an alternate form of information. And in this day and age, it's considered usually, or very easily, a conspiracy. Or just a plain lie. And so we're all supposed to be conforming, right? I had another commenter. It's been about a year. Another guy come in, he goes, "I love your show, cut your hair." And I just thought, wow, I like what you say, but conform. Conform, conform, conform. So I can feel better about you. Really funny, right? It happens. So if you were trying to create the narrative that is the straight and narrow official story, propaganda, revised history, that gives you power. It creates a Prussian state, right? We are this. We've never been anything else but this. This is where our people come from, right? To think that there are groups of people in this world that think that their people roamed around in the desert for 40 years. Unbelievable. I mean, it's 2017 and people are just like, Christ, a Disney comic book has more reality than most people's religions. It's crazy. So, but now if you were to create an organization like the Army Corps of PSYOPs or some other deep state, huge PR organization to enforce this straight and narrow, what are you going to do? What are your strategies, right? So we think we've, for instance, for Flat Earth and a few other things that have probably released since 2008, I should say, there was a cognitive infiltration document, supposedly, written by the government, circulated around the web to dispel essentially any conspiracy. You can attach it to this document and say, look, everything that you believe has been hatched by this organization to deceive you. The thing is, like I said in the beginning, what they want to do is make it painful. If you step off that sidewalk, your foot hits the third rail of a subway where all the power is going, and you get fried. You get fried to your relatives, to your friends, and then they don't really care whether or not they see you or they interact with you. What they want to make sure is that in your personal circle, you start looking like a crazy person or an ignorant person or both. Again, the oxymoron of our universe right now is that if someone were to talk about most religions, the modern day Christianity religion especially, and recall it as a true story, you'll be accepted in most circles in this world. And how unbelievable is that? I said way back in season 1 when I used to talk to Mormons when they would come by my house, one of the first group of guys that ever came over, I sat him down and I said, I had a globe that I was giving away or something my daughter was using when she was young, nothing fancy. And I said, if I said, I'm an Egyptian and I actually believe in all of the ancient gods of Egypt, Set and Horus and Isis and Anubis and every single thing ever written about those gods, what would you think of me? I said, wouldn't you think that I would be kind of a silly human being for believing in these sort of, animal head humans with all these incredible powers that have changed over time, of course, right? I said, what if I told you I'm Native American and I believe that all the stars in the skies are merely the souls of those who have left? That idea makes a hell of a lot more sense to me today than it ever did, to be honest. I said, wouldn't you think I'm crazy? And I said, why is it that all other religions seem hilarious to you, but yours seems ironclad, and yours has more elaborate fiction than any of theirs, or at least as much? Now, I'm going to take a position that they might take for a split second, because I think we need to look at this and be grown-ups about it, which is the following. What if we've been down this road before? We've been down this road before, and someone in, say, the Babylonian times said, we're always going to tell the truth. And there wasn't even a point of resistance. Not a single person disagreed with that idea. They're like, yeah, okay, we'll be completely honest. And that means you're honest with your children, you're honest with your spouse, your friends, everybody. And go take my episode on politics, which I probably should have called it something slightly different, where I simulate slowly the creation of a society on an island so you can see the power structure evolve and good people turn into bad people, simply because that's just one of those things that happen, or at least it happens in perception. With a few generations of spoiled children, you really do get corruption, right? But let's just say we had a society that was totally honest, and it really got ugly. It really got ugly very quickly. Maybe it was even good for 1,000 years, but after a while, stuff started accumulating. The very reason to perhaps not tell the truth started to exacerbate, right? And after perhaps a millennia of trying to hold it together, the elders of the world simply said, look, we have tried to educate our people as much as possible. We have tried to, enlighten each other on the empathetic needs of each other. Perhaps even back in that age, they had more empathy because they didn't have any distractions. And for whatever reason, it fell apart. And so the idea of the Prussian education system, which enforces loyalty over all other objectives, enforces it over truth. The elders of the world simply said, look, man, we have tried all kinds of different techniques, and some of it works for a little while, but then it crumbles. If any of you ever saw Groundhog Day back in the day with Bill Murray, there's a point in the center of the film, tiny spoiler alert if you haven't seen a 25-year-old movie, where he lives every single day over and over and over again. And he went to this town where he doesn't come from, and something happens where he keeps waking up. And so eventually he just gives up on what he was supposed to be doing, which is working with a TV crew. He just roams around town, he learns things, and he meets people. And he keeps bumping into this homeless man in an alleyway. And he just keeps ignoring him. But then eventually he pays attention to him and he says, I'm going to save this guy, right? So he picks him up off the street, gets him a lunch. Then eventually he dies in the alleyway later that day. And then he takes him to the hospital the next time he bumps into them, the very next day, tries to get a bunch of medical care on him, and he still dies in the alleyway. It's like this determined thing for this guy, right? So this could be the position of the folks that decide to help create the society around a group of people. Because no matter how you do this, like in my politics episode, someone's got to run the larger processes for society when it gets to a certain size. Because there's going to be conflict at some point. Not necessarily violent conflict or anything like that, but maybe there's two farmers and there's just a land dispute, and you got to figure out how to delegate authority to, okay, well, we need this much wheat and that much corn, and so we got to figure out how to do this, and people are going to have to get together and debate. And it could be that our elders have simply gone down a lot of paths, and prior to exploiting the system, which is, I think, where we are today, perhaps this was a technique that was just simply discovered to simply go, look, it is better that people don't know things that distract them, because it messes with the core resources of our society. What if the farmer, started playing with pottery, or started looking at his navel, or started noticing that there's another hill over there, and let's just go over there and figure out what's there. And so you lose your best farmer, the guy that knows how to rotate crops and plant seeds and understands the seasons. And because we've had perhaps some plague go through the village, we didn't have as many kids at a particular generation that we were supposed to have, because the women died or the children died or whatever. And so now we have to stretch one of the generations for another 15 to 30 years before we're going to have working males to go out and do the farms, right? All kinds of shit can happen in a split second to destroy a society. So there could be a lot of true history that we have no knowledge of that is giving the rationale to some individuals. And, there are tons of, philosophers on how to run society, Strauss and all those guys, Marxism and, how to run the economy, the economic layer and the resource layer and, what have you. I always mention the movie THX 1138. That is an extreme example of how society could turn out. I think below that you might have 1984, and below that you might have Brave New World, and below that you might have Rollerball in 1975. Just the ebbing progression into this control apparatus, right? So PSYOPs, I believe, could be the mechanism by which those who are inclined to think, those that are inclined to wander with their thoughts, can be manipulated. But I know that some of you are already thinking about the next section I want to discuss, so let's move right into it here. There are PSYOPs that might tell you that the world is round when it's flat. Because if you ever figured out it was flat, on any shape you want to think about, it's wavy or whatever, but it still has a border around it or something, most of us want to go see the border. And we want to know what the hell's on the outside. When, for all we know, the people who are on the other side don't want us there. In fact, they'll kill us if we go on the other side. And so our authorities might be like, look, we wanted to know too. And when we met them, they weren't very friendly. They said, keep your ass in your own little area. And by the way, you're an experiment to see who, if we can create the most resilient population or a species or whatever. You're an experiment, Who knows? It's just an example, okay? Don't go off the deep end. But there are groups that gain control and thus money and thus power, and it really comes down to having fancier stuff and having sex with whoever you want to have sex with. I mean, that's really as simple as it goes when it goes up the chain of command, right? And so the straight and narrow could be very dark. John F. Kennedy was murdered, not by Lee Harvey Oswald at all, right? So the folks that did that obviously had reasons to maintain their financial control over the United States of America, their military control over the United States of America, their political control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when this guy came in and he was smart enough with open eyes to say, Jesus, we gotta save this country, because his grandfather remembered what it was like before these people moved in and completely took everything over. So it seemed as if it was sort of a family conspiracy to get America back on track, a very familiar thing that's happening right now. JFK is killed, RFK is killed, and Ted Kennedy, who accidentally murdered his girlfriend, I don't think he intentionally meant to do that, but he accidentally kills his girlfriend, gets off scot-free because he's a royal Kennedy. The story is narrated that he was a coward and she was upside down in this car and he did not attempt to save her. Who knows? I'm not judging. I don't know the truth. He decided to join them. And honestly, if you had two brothers and both of them were murdered at a time when two other black leaders are murdered, at a time when, it's just prior to, Nixon had one of his running mates shot in the gut and paralyzed, right? I mean, just this country was out of fucking control in the 60s, right? So PSYOPs are potentially enforcing the Prussian narrative, which is to say, be loyal to country over all other things, And then there's the other side, which is, hey, don't look over here. Now, I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record, but let me just remind you. Let me just talk about it from my own perspective. I was, easily 46 years old before I ever contemplated for a second that the world might be a different shape. I went through my whole thing, and I came back using Expanding Earth and a few other things to return back to the heliocentric model, or at least heliocentric-ish model. It was funny, had you ever heard anyone, and again, I was a dude who aced the shit out of college astronomy without taking a single note, okay? I have never heard a scientist, a cosmologist, and believe me, I owned at one point probably 100 books that I devoured on the subject, including all the subatomic stuff, blah, blah, blah. So I had never heard anyone ever insinuate that the world was a pear shape or it has a swollen center. As a matter of fact, my teacher in high school, and I've heard this repeated, and I've actually asked people to confirm this over time, said that the Earth is so smooth that if you took a big giant towel and you dried off all the oceans, remember some of these are 7 miles deep plus, right? That is still smoother than the smoothest cue ball you could make for a game of pool, and it's more round. But as soon as flat Earth theory comes out, and really this statement's more for those of you who get very angry about someone even remotely entertaining the idea. Neil deGrasse Tyson comes out and says it's pear-shaped, indicating that there's a bottom to the Earth, like it knows that there's up and down. I can't imagine a more ludicrous example or theory that it's pear-shaped. That comes out and goes away. It's like he threw it out there to somehow, explain some of the weird data coming in from the flat Earth people, and then he hasn't said it again since. And then I think Bill Nye the douchebag guy comes out and starts talking about how it's, I forgot the name of the shape, but it's, the swollen center. The equator's a little more swollen, which would mean that the top curve and the lower curve of the North Pole and the South Pole are actually anything but pear-shaped. I never heard any alternate theories about the heliocentric shape of the Earth until a flat Earth community forced the scientific community to come out with these alternate statements. Never heard it before. All right. It seemed like damage control, didn't it? Why? If it's round, it's round. If it's not, it's not. I've said several times on this show, Joe Rogan used to believe that we hadn't gone to the moon. He had aggregated a pretty good collection of evidence as to why we didn't go. He was on Coast to Coast AM radio. In calls some expert from NASA who tells him a huge lie about how the Saturn V sent the capsule through the North Pole of the Van Allen belts to make sure it didn't run into as much Van Allen belts as it would had it gone out the middle, when the actual inverse concentration of electrons in the Van Allen belt would make that the most ignorant statement, because the North Pole and the South Pole is where it all ejects out and condenses down into the bowels of the Earth. So going out the North Pole to the South Pole would be the most lethal area. But Joe bought it, and Joe is flipped. And now Joe feels like he's in the club of the rest of the world who believe. Right? On Coast to Coast, you can hear, it's actually a video on YouTube too, you can hear Joe get punished for having an open mind. And he's punished with lies. And the worst part is, he bought it. Or someone came up to him. But I really think that Joe is a genuine dude. As much as he and I might disagree, I think he's genuine. I think he's speaking from his heart. I don't think he's sitting there saying something he doesn't believe, because I don't think he fears anybody in this world, least of all physically. And I think that someone operates from a different tone of voice if you have been forced to say something you don't believe, right? I don't think that many of you, regardless if you're pro or against anything I've said in this particular episode or any other episodes, would argue that humanity thinking and researching and going in that loop is anything but a great thing. But I think that that's what we've allowed to occur. And we are relegated to hanging on to official stories lest we be demonized to the public at large, right? So what do we do about all this? What do we do about this sort of orchestrated pressure? We have fake news organizations, and I would say almost all of them are fake unless they are made by you, the people. Then they have a chance of being true. And then our burden as being sort of alternate folks, and I'm not saying me because I'm not really trying to bring you any news, but we have to do incredible due diligence to figure out if what we're saying is actually true. And again, one of the most valuable things that you can do with your research is simply to call out the question and to say, well, I'm not sure, who did 9/11 or why, but I'm going to tell you right now, those buildings were demolished. Physics completely counters everything you saw that morning. Out of 110 stories of steel, it turned into dust. There's barely anything left at the bottom of those buildings. And everyone who's involved with pancake theory knows that it would be, 30 to 35 floors worth of steel at the bottom once you compress all the air out of the steel that it took to build that place. The concrete center columns of the World Trade Centers 1 and 2 simply vanished. That doesn't happen, right? They don't fall down for one thing, and they sure as hell don't just vanish. Right. And yes, there was tons of steel all over the place, but per capita for the two gigantic 110-story buildings, something from probably space atomized the shit out of these things. The Hutchison effect, right? Hutchison, who had all of his research, I think, confiscated by the Canadian government, and then the Canadian government sold it to the United States government. Crazy, right? It may be just to simply wipe out any evidence that this technology exists, but there's a lot of research students over the last 50, 60 years who have taken paper clips and resonated them out of existence. It takes a lot of energy, but if the Van Allen belts truly exist and we can truly put a satellite in space, trust me, you can find pretty much infinite power up there for anything you need to do down here on Earth. And John L. Rumsfeld said there are directed energy weapons within 7 days of 9/11. With the general standing right next to him. He just said they don't use them, that's all. But what do we do about this? I think the number one thing we can do is be very careful as we ridicule people in our own brains. Before we ever speak a word out loud, before we ever type in a sentence in a comment anywhere, I have an episode in season 1, I believe, called The Unknown. It's a very important episode. Maybe it's in season 2, I can't remember. But it's all about being okay with not knowing. And I think that's probably the lubrication we need in our brains to live with uncertainty, right? And I think at this point in our society, I think a lot of us feel like the quality of living has gone down quite a bit. And it usually gets counteracted in the United States by people that simply say, yeah, well, you have no idea how bad it is outside the United States, so you're probably one of the luckier people on this planet if you live in the United States. And I've heard arguments to the contrary on that too, trust me. Now, having grown up as a kid in the United States of America, when people had very little knowledge about anything, yet they were able to pay for everything in the house with one income, I know that today is a farce, right? It is a complete farce, and my father was able to pay all the bills when I was a kid. It didn't matter if he drove a UPS truck or sold used cars or whatever, worked for the National Guard after he got out of the military. He was able to pay all the bills. And sure, it was tight every once in a while, but that's because we went on vacation. And so we took a little hit, put it on credit cards, a little bit of it on credit cards, and we had to pay it all down. So it was good at one point. The 70s, I'm telling you right now, were, in terms of the quality of the family, was phenomenal, at least in the Midwest. And I know enough people now in their 60s and 70s and 80s here in Los Angeles that sentiment is echoed 100%. No one said, oh, well, the 70s were horrible. Now, again, no one likes war, so no one liked Vietnam and what it was doing to our kids. There's always some little dark spot due to the bankers. But overall, you could just go get a college degree, you could get it without debt, and you could come out and just get a job. And most jobs and most degrees are related to trade skills, right? As we always say on the show. And so the official narrative does very little to preserve this magic moment in history where things were really, really good. I even think the Middle East in general, which, again, there was the Iran war and a few other things. I think that most of the people in those countries actually lived a much better life than they do right this very second in some regards. Of course, now they've got McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken and cell phones and drugs, knocking it out like we are. But I have to say that I am unaware of any official narrative that if we all followed it, we would be anything other than slaves headed towards the THX 1138 eventuality, where we're all wearing, white fascist robes with bald heads and just taking our food supplements every day with robotic Boston Dynamic robots, with gold, or was it silver faces, cop outfits hitting us with cattle prods. The first substructure that will put that in place is socialism, which is so hilariously pushed by Antifa, the anti-fascism group, right? They are the number one faction on this planet that is bringing into effect the THX 1138 reality. The first phase of it all. It's really funny. I was eating my dinner last night by myself, and I had two gentlemen right in front of me, literally 3-4 feet in front of me. They're sitting perpendicular to my viewing angle. And it was two guys having sort of a Trump bashing conversation. One guy's really, really young, probably in his late 20s, mid-20s, and the other guy's some really old, disgusting, weird guy. And they're going back and forth, and it became apparent that the young guy was just young and uneducated about the world in general, which is very typical, and that's where I was when I was his age. And again, you shouldn't have to, unless you devote yourself to politics, know anything more than how maybe the legislative bodies work and how bills are passed and created and that kind of thing, which we have cartoons in the United States that teach you how that works. But the older gentleman was really struggling to speak the English language, I think, and he immediately went into his disenfranchised spiel, which is what I covered in the cultism episode. And he was essentially hating on everyone else because when he was young, I guess he was, as he said himself, he goes, I had curly hair and I was fat. And so people didn't like me. And so for him, the narrative that helps him out is to say, I'm going to go with the underdog group, literally just simply brands themselves the underdog group. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But, when your group controls all the press in the world and all the textbooks, I hardly think you're the disenfranchised. But now it used to be back in the day that the politicians of the world just became fat cats. And they gain that control, right? They get the best property, the best human options for sex. They usually stay within their age bracket. They didn't run after children most of the time. But I would say over the last 30 years, that's all changed. And the fringy things that we heard happening in Bohemian Grove and a bunch of other crazy, cult locations are now starting to become mainstream. When I was a kid, if somebody murdered someone, it was a big deal. Serial murders really came out of the late 70s, Son of Sam, and then there's the Atlanta, Georgia killer, and, it ramped up. And nowadays, when you hear about what happens in the news, and I don't know, maybe this did happen a long time ago, but it seems like, when someone is caught for murder or something, it's put on the front page of all the news to traumatize you so you believe everything else they're shoving down your throat. The crimes are horrendous. And so the very lust fabric that's in a human being starts to become insane nowadays, in my opinion, right? So the very quality of the threads in the social fabric of our society are starting to degrade at rapid paces. And I don't think this is any news to anyone out there. But probably around the mid-40s, we had something introduced into the water supply as a test, I believe in Pennsylvania, as it was initially told to me, fluoride, a toxic substance that is the residual product of creating aluminum. Now, again, there's minute amounts of this in agriculture, but we're talking about for the parts per million in your toothpaste and the parts per million in, say, black tea, it's like probably 1 to 1,000,000 in terms of ratio. Your body can handle minute amounts that don't have any ability to touch your physiology. When you start jamming this stuff in your mouth, it's like a lab rat. When we feed lab rats GMO wheat, they grow tumors that are 50% the magnitude of their own bodies. 50%, and then they die really quickly. Well, when we compare that to the way per capita we would ingest GMO foods, the FDA says, well, again, I'll be retired by the time everyone starts dying of cancer. And because cancer doesn't leave a calling card as to how it occurs, no one will ever find out. So the stuff that's happening today is a little bit different than the stuff that used to happen in the past. We know that depopulation is a central focus of the ruling class of the world. I'll remind you, this is very important. A buddy of mine was hired to speak about electric cars. And in the room was one of the little Rothschild kids, right? And he's the young guy that went around and couldn't figure out the order of the planets, right? Because either he knows something we don't, or he's one of the dumbest people on planet Earth who missed virtually every astronomy book published in the last 100 years. My friend is no more than 10 minutes into his presentation when this Rothschild kid said, I don't know why we're worried about all this electric car crap. What we need to be worried about is depopulation. And my buddy's 30-minute presentation was cut short as they all went around the room, brown-nosing this guy and all coming up with depopulation, how horrible the world's going to be and how fast the population's going to grow. And it's whatever it takes to get rid of this. And again, the big threat, the passive threat about depopulation is that if we don't do something now, that what we're going to have to do in 50 to 100 years is going to be draconian, killing people simply because they exist. And they're, again, the model does hold up under certain, mathematical realities. The population growth is exponential under certain scenarios. But again, as I've always said on the show, if overpopulation was a huge problem, then there would be cataclysmic changes to India and China. And none of that is happening. In fact, China removed their, one-child policy because they're running out of people to pay for the old people's salaries, and they're definitely running out of girls. The number I've heard is there's 11 boys to every girl. But in China, the boys are worshipped as princes and kings, and the girls are just blah. They're the stupid idiots, right? Again, these are from my friends who are Chinese that go to China constantly from China telling me this. So I guess they could be wrong, but I'm not just making that up out of some weird article I read. And I have at least one American friend who's lived there for 7 years. And he loves it over there. He loves the people. But we're not doing anything about curbing population control on a level that is sort of a household methodology, right? 2 people have 1 child. They get their child, but they reduce population by 1. 2 people have 2, maintains. Anything over expands, right? We have, clouds now exclusively made by planes. Exclusively made. My sky right now is probably about, 25, 30% full of white debris that is coming out of planes that can't seem to, keep the trail coming out of the plane the entire time. It starts, it stops, it has logical shapes and all kinds of stuff. See my episodes on chemtrails to hear all the details about that. But the second they started spraying on November 10th, I filmed a little video for MK Ultra Radio page on Facebook, told everyone they're going to get sick. And sure enough, within 5 days, everybody I knew in Los Angeles was fighting a cold. A couple of my friends got severely ill. And, if you have a friend who's your age, young, and they get sick, I'm making that bias statement right now, you're like, okay, you're going to pull through it. You'll just get a little cold, and that's okay. But when you have friends in their 80s and 70s who gets these ailments, a cold could kill them, combined with other ailments and a weaker immune system and age in general. And so I think they know what game they're playing. Flouride in 1954 was made a mainstream chemical in all, well, not all water, but anyone that was susceptible to putting that in their water supply. I did find out recently, I'd say within the last 10 years, that my hometown did not fluoridate its water. They may have done it since, but when I was growing up, I didn't have it, right? But again, I didn't sit around drinking water out of the tap very much. But who knows how that absorbs into your system, right? So back on track with the PSYOP train, the thing is the more people that wake up, it's going to mess with the official narrative. What's beautiful about it is that PSYOPs, no matter how they work, unless they can infect your body with a chemical, aspartame, fluoride, whatever, GMO foods that just simply terminate your gene sequence, unless they can get inside your body, vaccinations, flu shots, all that shit, you're going to be a problem no matter how they try to come at you. Because you're going to think, and you're going to research, and you're going to have some due diligence. As long as there's a little humility in your own opinion-making process, you'll come out on top in the end. And that's what's exciting. One of the reasons why I like making episodes like this on a fairly, maybe every 20-episode heartbeat, is we do need reminders that this stuff's going on around us. We do need reminders every once in a while to stay in control, stay in control. Own your own opinions of all things. There is an amazing amount of history that was injected into us about the 20th century that is now being undone, that has essentially been forbidden to be even questioned. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? People are said to be some of the most evil people in the world that have ever existed are now being exonerated at alarming rates. And what's interesting is they're being exonerated by people that were supposedly the victims of these individuals. And so could you imagine someone telling you a story that your uncle died because of a bad person? And you pretty much believe that your whole life. And then you hit 40 and new information starts arising and you start going, oh my God, was I being duped? Was I being duped that I was a victim of this particular individual when it never really happened? And truth is so powerful for people these days that they are actually, I think, coming around. And they're saying, look, I would rather know the truth and that I was duped than anything else in the entire world. And then I'm going to find out how that came to pass, who's enforcing it to this day. You know, we have this big saying right now that's been around for quite a while, but was it Hunter Thompson said on 9/11, the morning of 9/11, he said, just follow the money and you'll find out who did this. And he was right. But revised history that is enforced by laws, let's just say, is also, you know, it's not necessarily follow the money, it's follow the benefit structure. Who benefited, right? Which is the other saying, I can't remember, it's in Latin too. I've had individuals in my life that I've given the privilege to instruct me and be my bosses, and I have to say that the majority of them honored that privilege beautifully, and every time I'm given a role of authority, I do my very best to be as humble and as humiliated as possible and really keep my employees safe and happy and on the right track. But there's been a couple times where I've had individuals that, for whatever reason, through cronyism or nepotism or just sheer luck, they get to be my boss. And, you know, I don't care really how anyone gets in charge of my, daily efforts or whatever, as long as they're good people. They don't have to be perfect. They can have flaws. They can mess up. They can have bad judgment every once in a while. We're all human, right? But what's interesting is the ones that really are, and I've only met a couple that are really, truly, I think, dark inside. I don't know if anyone's truly evil. I don't know if I've ever bumped anyone like that. But I bumped into a few folks that are, I'd say, extremely selfish. And what has been the case for me, and I'm making this example because this is where you're going to view yourself in contrast to society and controlling bodies around you, whether it be governmental or whatever. On an individual level, this is much easier. But the times that I have essentially taken away their control and probably angered them is when I simply communicated with them, I am no longer allowing you to control me. I quit, and I haven't really, well, actually, I guess I've jumped ship a couple times when companies that I've worked for got the wrong leadership, that I could sense that we were going out of business, even though, in fact, I left one company that had just gotten a huge $3.5 million infusion of cash, and I watched marketing blow it on a level that was incredible. And I essentially found a new job. I was jumping ship from the database industry into the internet industry 100%. Took a tiny pay cut, really tiny pay cut. And the CEO wandered in my office one day, because he had heard that I had resigned. And he was being very cordial about it. And I don't know if he cared whether or not his company went down or not, because he was brought in as sort of an emergency CEO to fix things. He didn't really try to talk me back into staying or anything like that. But in the conversation, it came up where I told him, I said, your company's going out of business. And I've been with this company since 1992, and now it's 1997. Actually, I was in there in 1991. So off and on, I worked for them as their chief engineer, and then I left, did some consulting work, and then I came back as one of their lead designers. And he looked at me funny, like, you really think we're going out of business? We just got some money, and we just did a bunch of marketing push and all this other stuff. And I said, yeah, I just know it. This is done. And sure enough, within 12 months of me leaving, the company had sold its brand and its technology off to some other company. And the funny thing is, it still exists to this day, and I have no idea on earth who would ever buy the product and ever use it. But it's still out there, like old legacy point of sale systems. You'll see that run in DOS at some restaurant. It's a company that hasn't sold a new copy since 1995, but they still have install base of a couple thousand that can keep people employed, right? The reason why I mention that example to you is that a lot of what you think controls you is simply in your head, right? National debt is just a concept that we believe as a society, when all the debt that we have acquired is through illegal Ponzi schemes. But we sit around and worry about the national debt. Debt to whom? Banking cartels that loan us money with no ability to pay back the interest that it has never created? Isn't that interesting? Who would have ever thought that we would have millions of people around the world who understand that all of a sudden? The internet's made that possible for now, right? I don't usually mention current affairs that much, but I do want to say, because I had a couple of young people come at me they're in their early 20s, and they said they're very concerned. But because I'm a trusted asset of their family, they were coming to me and saying, well, what about this net neutrality thing? Isn't it something we want to save? I mean, it sounds good, net neutrality. Well, when you follow the money and you follow who benefits from it, it was funded up to, I believe, $72 million to create the bill that was passed, and it was funded by George Soros, championed by Google and Apple and all these companies that want to legally engage in censorship. The Patriot Act is anything other than patriotic, and net neutrality is anything other than neutral. And of course, they scare you with these stupid stories about, well, the ISPs, the internet service providers, can charge you, different bandwidth for television versus audio versus video and all this other stuff. And it's like, not in a free market, they can't, right? And we'll just simply stop buying their bullshit if that's the case. We will create our own little dark net or subnet or kim.com net, and we'll wipe you out. And you'll have no power over us because you happen to, like Princess Leia said to Tarkin, you squeeze too much, we pop out through your fingers, right? Slip through your fingers, I guess is the term. So as I'm preaching to you that you should maintain control of your own mind and have your own discipline towards things, some of you might have this feeling of despair that that's not a possibility for you. But it is. It is instantaneously. One of the problems we have, though, is that this starts happening a little too early, and it starts happening in areas that shouldn't happen sometimes. What am I talking about? Well, how many times? Well, let's put it this way. If you're over 45, let's just say, which means you have a pretty good grasp of what it was like to live in the 70s, kids did not lip off to their parents like they do today. Kids did not do the things in society, in at least most of America, like they do today. Disobeying is sort of the way that one conceives of a rite of passage in today's environment, which is obviously not good, because unless the child is able to acquire a tremendous amount of education and eclipse their parents' experience with life, right, and their wisdom of life, they're not equipped to make their own decisions yet. But society says, hey, rebel, rebel, rebel. This is what's cool, right? The other thing to keep in mind which I may or may not have mentioned in the YouTube phenomenon video, is, with this new medium and this new batch of information about reality, one, there's no policing of the information, which again is good, right? We do not want a bunch of regulations on how we pass new information from one person to another. It is best if the information is passed in a public forum, which is why I love YouTube. If I were to come up here and tell you something nuts and put it on YouTube, well, then it's out there for the world, and it can get picked up by news organizations, bloggers, and they can say, listen to this guy's crazy thing, right? There's been a reprisal of interest in the no forest on flat Earth theory that, every volcanic magma crystallization is the base of a tree. Well, that guy put himself out there. He created a tremendous amount of interest. It was ripped off and reposted 1,000 times, translated, all this other stuff. And hey, in the end, it's probably all horse crap for the reasons I noted in my episode against it. But what's beautiful about it is everybody started thinking for a split second. And some people kept thinking as a result of ever seeing it, right? So if we're in a new medium whereby information is going around and we're trying to figure out what's a PSYOP and what's real, well, anything that's controversial could be called a PSYOP. Anything. Doesn't mean it is, right? A PSYOP is truly someone who is in government or a deep state organization who is trying to manipulate your belief system such that, again, you'll get burned, or you get burned in reputation. But let's say that you don't have any friends or family that you share this stuff with. You just don't. You're smart. You want to vet it for years before you ever pass it out to anyone. You're waiting for a rocket test to find out whether or not the world's round or not, right? You still have it going on inside your mind. And so there's still a game being played all the time inside our hearts, inside our souls. I had a weird vision the other day, and it was just one of these silly things. I was working on some script ideas, and what I'm about to say is not related to any script of mine, but I thought, imagine you die, and your body passes away, and your soul transcends to the other ubiquitous layer of reality with all the other souls, and you find yourself sort of proverbially inside a locker room of some sort, and you're kind of coming off your shift. You're like, whoa, what am I doing here? You're like, yeah, that being human thing, yeah. Well, that was just, we're working on an experiment here to create the best human figure. And then you go, my vision just kept kind of going, and it was like having that conversation with someone in the locker room, and you're saying, well, really? That was an experiment? Oh, yeah, this whole thing, yeah. Yeah, it's a disc, but, we got it under control. Trust me, they'll never figure it out no matter what. And you go, well, what happened? What was all the chemtrails for, all the poison and stuff? And they're like, that. Well, what's going on with that is that we've allowed the leaders of that realm to know what's kind of going on, just a little bit, so they know what's kind of hip. But we do have to control the population within the dome, and we'd rather not unleash the plague and create a lot of suffering. So we're letting people have a pretty good life, but it's going to be shortened by toxins and that kind of stuff. So we have to keep this all under control. And then you're kind of going, well, what do I do now? Well, you can take a break if you want. There's a bunch of Cheez-Its in that room over there, and there's some women over there if that's what you're into. And, eventually you come back and you can dial up wherever you want to be in society. We don't let you go back in time or anything, but yeah, you can drop in wherever you want. There's a whole scale of difficulty right there. If you want to be a little boy in a slum lord place in India, you can do that, or you can be a privileged rich kid, but those rich kid slots are going fast, right? And the whole kind of weird storyline in my head, which is obviously just a fictional thought process I was going through, is that maybe this world doesn't matter as much as we think it does, second to second. But even if we're an experiment and this is a matrix and all that kind of thing, then it would be essentially a really amazing video game. It is the ultimate VR. We are in it to win it, And imagine if you kept a tremendous amount of your wisdom and knowledge as sort of this algorithmic knowledge and instinct in your system as a soul, and then you go back down and live again, then you sort of have that third eye that's I shouldn't do this. I feel like I've done this before. I feel like that's a bad idea. And you don't, zip down the highway in some old shitty car going 130 miles an hour, and then you wreck and die. That doesn't happen because you have an instinct that that's a bad idea because you've either done it before or you saw someone do it. Perspective. I don't think everything that you disagree with online or that has a movement is a PSYOP. I think it would be an amazing piece of information to learn. Is it a PSYOP? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to know all the facts of the universe that you live in, basically planet Earth? Just what's really going on? Who's really in charge? Who built the Georgia Guidestones? Who updated the Georgia Guidestones with the little 2014 stone at the top? Who did that? Why did they do that? Someone spent some money. Someone organized it. Someone sliced it out, put this little brick in there. Well, what happened in 2014? I don't know of any cataclysmic thing that happened in 2014. Do you? Supposedly the world was supposed to end, due to Planet X bullshit, which keeps coming and going and coming and going, and people keep jumping on that religious bandwagon that there's this alternate, solar system that kind of orbits into our solar system and kills everything. How many times will these people jump on that bandwagon and fail and keep jumping back on? Why would they do that? What's their motivation inside to believe in a doomsday situation? Is it the doomsday promise? Right? Oh my God, there's another episode right there. God's coming. The dome owners are coming. It's all going to be resolved. No more taxes. No more stress. It's Cinnabons for everybody, right? It used to be that we would say, hey, get a good education and all this will be a hell of a lot easier. And there's probably more truth to that than anything else. But nowadays, we know that textbooks are written by European agencies to keep you away from knowing how things work in this world, as we always say on the show. So you then lack the capability of making connections. You lack the ability to develop any valuable intuition. That's a pretty slippery slope. The two gentlemen in front of me were talking last night. Is this guy, God bless him, he was, I hate to say this, but you've been in public and you've talked to people who think slowly. You can just hear it in their sentence construction. You can hear it in their gullibility of what they think is true and false. Like they're so certain about things they can't be certain about, et cetera, et cetera. He was saying that he is completely against the home schooling that people do today. Now, I will confess that when I first heard about one of my relatives homeschooling, I was pretty terrified because she might be one of the least educated, least experienced human beings in our entire family. So when she was going to homeschool her kids, I was like, oh my God, really? The blind leading the blind? This is horrendous. But then I started meeting people who were young people in their 20s, and they were extremely brilliant, extremely, I would say, on the straight and narrow of truth. Capable of kind of saying, I don't know what the truth is most of the time, but I research and I try to figure out what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, right? And then I said, well, where'd you go to school? It came up. Oh, well, up until high school, I was homeschooled, and then I went to high school. And I said, well, what was that experience like? He said, it was pretty tough, actually. And I said, in my brain, I'm thinking, oh, because your parents didn't teach you much, right? And you're struggling with catching up with everyone at an academic level, and it was completely the opposite. They said, no, everybody was stupid at school. I couldn't believe the basics that they didn't understand. And so it was very, very tough. And so I thought of school as more like a social experience, and if I really wanted to continue my education, I had to take over when my parent left off. And so, and the same was true for their college days as well. But they're able to kind of get into advanced placement courses and challenge themselves for the first time since they got out of their own homeschooling. So homeschooling is a lot different now than it used to be, right? There's always exceptions to the rule, always. But what this guy was saying, without saying it, it was in front of me at this restaurant last night, was that, his concern was that the official narrative of which he obviously was hugging very tightly to his chest, was no longer going to propagate more children into the system that would be compatible with his narrative of the world. And so it was kind of protectionism for his own compatibility with the universe, of which, seen through his conversation with this other younger guy, he had just pretty much reached the sweet spot where the social justice warrior fabric of Antifa gave him a platform to be disenfranchised and to say, yeah, I hate all pretty people. The guy said no less than 3 times, probably more, how he was fat and he had curly hair. And, he said that he made this interesting example. It was really funny. He said, if I want to care about what I look like, he goes, I would stay inside all day. And he goes, or I would get rid of all the mirrors in the world. I thought, wow, that was kind of a weird statement, right? He obviously was very comfortable, well, at least in his outward persona. He was comfortable in being overweight, being very scruffy, had a really weird beard, and he did have very curly hair. So when he said he had curly hair, he wasn't joking. Very dense, super tight curly hair. It's all gray, And I think what he was trying to get to with this kid was to say, let's not let pretty people take over the world. And which was kind of funny because the guy he was talking to was, on all accounts, a very handsome, very well built, probably 6 foot plus kid who was essentially being indoctrinated by this guy across the table. How they know each other, I don't know. They didn't seem to have any relation or work stories or any, backstories. Like they were just meeting each other for the first time at this restaurant. Who knows, right? A little Tinder action, I guess, maybe. It certainly didn't look compatible, let me tell you that. But it was eye-opening to sit and watch this. It was kind of painful for about half of it. But then when I started kind of listening to this guy go on and on, Marilyn Manson has made an entire career out of the disenfranchised his entire life. He wrote the song, The Beautiful People. And I will say that song really shook my mind back when he came out with that. And I thought, oh my God, yeah, I guess from the perspective, if you didn't feel like you were pretty, which is obviously a social definition of what is pretty, again, there's always someone for somebody. There always is, right? No matter what you look like, there's someone out there that loves exactly what you look like, period. Exactly who you are as a human being, what you know and what you don't know, right? But he was talking about how going to school made him, very uncomfortable. Being in society made him uncomfortable. And so his kind of subtextual goal was to make everyone uncomfortable so that he wouldn't be sort of the only guy that feels this way. I don't know what I would have been like as a person where I looked in the mirror and thought I was unattractive. I don't know. I don't know what that would be like, right? I didn't really, if anyone ever complimented the way I looked as a kid, which definitely happened, I was sort of incapable of letting it go to my head or become a part of me. I'd ever walked into a room and said, well, I'm definitely better looking than that person. That just, for whatever reason, my upbringing, my genes, it just was repulsed by such an elitist notion. And again, I might be good looking in my neighborhood, but in other neighborhoods, I am, the devil. Who knows, right? I hope you feel me. I'm losing my light, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. It's even darker with sunglasses, of course. But if you're on the truth path with a capital T, it's a tough path to have. I got lots of episodes about it. There's a lot of punishment involved with it. Just, as much as you might think that things are psyops, throw it out there. Keep it out there in the back of your head. But I think the official story is more of a psyop than any conspiracy out there. So let's do this. I know that people who make videos bait everyone to make comments, and I always absolutely hate hearing this bullshit at the end of an episode on YouTube. It's like, oh, tell me what you think about the Oreo cookies in the comment section. But let's do this in this particular comment section because you guys have some big brains out there, man, and your comments are usually insanely insightful with just a sentence or two. Feel free to write a manifesto. Just put it all in one comment for me, please. Let me know what you fear is a psyop out there, and Also, let me know what you think might just be an organic movement that has either stayed organic or become a PSYOP. Let's delve into some of the things. Mention flat Earth, mention whatever you want to do, conspiracies of history or science or whatever, but where do you think we have it most correct, and where do you think we're being duped away from the most correct, or duped into something that is completely incorrect, right? So I think that has value. I would love to compare notes with you guys, and I think it would be healthy for all of us to kind of compare notes on this particular episode. So deepthoughtsradio.com for all the feeds. There's video and audio. Your video is YouTube and vid.me. Audio is iTunes and Google Play, but you can just go to deepthoughtsradio.com and subscribe to the RSS feed straight from there. I will warn you, as of right now in December, actually it's the tail end of November 2017, I had to move off of a really expensive server, which does a much better job hosting the podcast. You're going to need to download the episodes to whatever podcast device you have, because you will not be able to start and stop. At least with Podcast Addict, you can't do it, to start and stop in the middle of an episode, because the server, I think, is having a bit of it's just configured not to allow somehow random access to an MP3. I don't know why. There's also Patreon if you guys want to contribute. Some folks have said that they don't want to go through Patreon because they take so much tax out of your contribution. I might be putting up a PayPal for anybody who wants to do that. I'm not sure if there's a reoccurring PayPal interface. I've done a lot of PayPal programming in my life, but I've never done I've used other services. Once they want to go to a reoccurring billing system, we go to much more powerful systems that use all kinds of different backends. So I might put that together if you guys are interested in that. But regardless, take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.